John, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I just got back from my first vacation in forever, so I'm relaxed for a
Aw-
change.
Awesome. Rest and recharge and ready
Yeah,
to take
exactly.
dozens of questions today
Yeah, well, hopefully
on
we can get
everything
through a lot
economy
of
and
them.
Boston.
How about yourself?
Doing well, no complaints. Another week, making progress, obviously, with the COVID recovery and the reopening and stuff, which we'll dive into. So looking forward to it. We'll give everybody just about 10 o'clock. So we'll give everybody maybe another 20, 30 seconds today. We started a little bit early and then we'll dive in. We got a couple good questions to start it off. For those just logging on, there is a Q&A box, which you can submit questions to myself and John. It'll pop up on our screen. So as you're listening with any of the topics we're covering, if there's any questions that pop into mind, feel free to hit the button, just type in the question. It will pop up and then we'll take those as they come. All right, John, we're probably good to get started. I'm sure we'll have some people logging in now that's just 10. Wanted to start this morning. We were just talking, obviously, before we came on about some of the reporting that you've been doing. Talk a little bit about, the recent reporting that you have. I know there's stuff around the bag ban, around alcohol to go from restaurants. Just update the group on kind of, what's going on with those things, and then any other updates top of your mind, and then we'll dive into some of the questions.
So the latest news out of the Baker administration that they back in March they put a hold on all the local bans on plastic bag use, single-use plastic bags at supermarkets. There was a concern that the reusable bags, which was what those bans were intended to encourage, were carrying COVID or were a way to transmit COVID. And I think we've learned more about the virus and that it's not easily transmitted on surfaces, or it's much more of an airborne thing. And so I think the concerns about it being carried in and out of supermarkets on reusable bags have lessened. So the administration on Friday basically said, okay, cities and towns, your local bag bans can go back into effect. The retailers were sort of expecting this would come, but they wanted a little more advance notice because they have all these plastic bags that they, single-use plastic bags that they ordered that they now have to sell, use up. And I think you're going to see cities and towns be a little relaxed in enforcing this for a bit. Well, the best example is Boston's basically said, supermarkets, drugstores, you can go through the end of September before you have to switch over to a paper bag or a compostable bag, just to give time to, to switch over, to order supplies and to use up the plastic bags you have on hand. But this applies to all retailers, but it was really geared for supermarkets and drugstores back in the pandemic, because those were the main ones that were open at the time. So I don't know. I think it's pretty well assumed that you're not going to be carrying in germs on a reusable bag, and it's not going to leap off and infect somebody else. So the environmentalists are obviously very happy about this because they've worked very hard in the last year or so to get local plastic bag bans in place across the state, and they were lobbying the administration to sort of lift this ban on bans.
And then talk a little bit about alcohol to go in some of the restaurants. I know there was some, back and forth about that. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, this has been a bit of a controversy for between the package stores and the restaurant association. The restaurants really, we'll talk a little more about this as we go through the half hour. Restaurants are struggling almost like no other industry, and the state legislature is trying to figure out ways to help them out. One of the ways was allowing them to sell beer and wine from, as the way a package store does, out off premises, and that was allowed fairly early in the pandemic. Now there's a push to allow what's known as cocktails to go, essentially mixed drinks that can be sold for takeout with a meal, and that proved to be a bit of maybe a bridge too far for the package stores. They fought it. uh, particularly they're worried about it becoming permanent. They're very nervous that some of these, it's what's known as a three-tier system in the alcohol business is being broken down because of the pandemic, and that package stores will be bypassed, once we get through all this. And so they really want to make it clear that this should be, if cocktails to go are going to be allowed, they have to be just during the state of emergency and no later. So the Senate did pass a bill that ties it to the state of emergency, which the package stores are more friendly to, than the House bill, which pushed it off to next March, or end of February, early March, and also, or the end of the state of emergency, whichever comes later. And so the problem is now, because there are two different bills kicking around, you're going to have to reconcile those differences before you send it to the governor. So it's going to take a little bit longer before the cocktails to go becomes law in Massachusetts.
Definitely. So we had a couple questions submitted before the Zoom. Just a reminder, I know we had a bunch of people join. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. So we are taking additional questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can. But we did have a couple submitted. So why don't we start running down those to start. The first one, John, is about, you were just talking a little bit about the negative impact on restaurants, and obviously the restaurants are struggling. This question's about possible replacements for restaurants, seeing as people are making decisions if they feel comfortable dining out or not, or if they're going to do takeout. So this person was more looking specifically about food trucks, things like that. Do you see things like food trucks being more successful because of the challenges restaurants are facing?
Yeah, I think it's still early. The Massachusetts Restaurant Association basically interviewed the two biggest wholesalers for restaurants in the state, and based on those interviews, they expect essentially around 1 out of 5 restaurants not to survive this pandemic. I think it's going to be the restaurants that are really going to struggle are the high-end restaurants that do not have takeout or outdoor seating already. I think even though the indoor seating is allowed in Massachusetts now, it's restricted. You can't, you're sort of at, it's roughly a little less than half capacity, I guess, in most places, in terms of the tables that have been taken out for social distancing. And because people tend to eat at the same time, it's going to make it harder for especially the high-end restaurants to, make a profit during those key hours of the day. I think food trucks are positioned well to kind of benefit from all of this, in part because it's, to go, it's a little less expensive. People are going to be looking for it. We're in a pretty serious recession, and so the discretionary, people are generally going to be more cautious about discretionary spending. And I think anything that sort of encourages outdoor dining is going to do better than indoor dining. We've seen, I think I'm not familiar with all of the states and their own restrictions on indoor dining, but we've seen problems crop up. California, for example, it was the first considered one of the good examples of recovering from or making it through COVID, and now they're really struggling and shutting down indoor dining. And I don't see that happening in Massachusetts yet, unless we really start to see an uptick in COVID cases like California's seeing. But I think the problem is it sort of magnifies the risks inherent with indoor dining. I think, we have pretty strict restrictions on indoor dining in Massachusetts, and I'd like to think that those will keep us safe if we go indoors. But I think in the consumer's mind, they're hearing about these problems in other parts of the country and might be more reluctant to eat indoors for a while, even if it is safe here, because of what they're hearing of what's happening in other states. So that's why I think you're going to see a real, we were probably oversaturated with restaurants in Massachusetts to begin with, particularly in Greater Boston. We had an explosion of them in the last decade. A real surge in employment in the restaurant industry. Is one of the fastest growing industries. So I think, in a recession that was not pandemic related, we would have a natural culling or a thinning out a bit of the restaurant industry. But because of the pandemic, it's really going to make people think twice about sitting down inside a restaurant for an extended period of time. And so I do think if you're in the restaurant business, thinking about things like delivery, think food delivery, if restaurants are now allowed to sell food, groceries, that sort of thing, thinking about making sure you have outdoor seating and getting involved in other ways, looking for new ways to bring in revenue aside from the traditional indoor dining experience is going to be essentially how you're going to survive until we have a vaccine.
Definitely. It's definitely, crazy for us after going through, the lockdown kind of early March and April to see the other states that are now kind of seeing their spikes and then having to go through kind of similar economic conditions and, kind of lifestyle conditions that we already went through. It's pretty crazy.
It's, unfortunately for them, many of them did not have the strict restrictions that we had to put in place almost right away. And what you're seeing now is sort of a shift in that, originally in Massachusetts, it was really the older populations that were getting hit because it was, the nursing homes were a real problem. And then we locked down and we were able to start to get it under control. But in many of the states, it's the younger populations because they're more likely to be out and about in bars and other public activities and crowds. And so it's spreading. And I think, I think many younger people thought they were impervious to it, or if they caught it, they would be fine. And for many younger people, it is just like a bad flu if you get it. But for many, it's not. It's much worse, and it can have real crippling implications, especially if you have to get on a ventilator to stay alive. So I think that's sort of one of a market difference in what's happening in the States now that are seeing the spikes than what happened here in Massachusetts.
Yeah, definitely. Let's move on to the next question that we have. This question's about any potential governmental help around business interruption insurance, being able to cover small business losses. Do you know anything about that or the possibility of that?
This is a really hot topic because many businesses bought business interruption insurance to cover, it's the sort of thing like if you get hit with a flood or a fire, it's not just the damage from the building that your inventory or your building that you have to worry about. It's the lack of revenue while you're shut down. But many of these policies have exclusions for viruses, and a lot of businesses have probably never really thought about that exclusion until now. And so they're pushing legislators to come up with a solution. In Massachusetts, we do have a bill pending, but I honestly think it's going to be hard to see it passing. There's a lot of questions about the constitutionality of it. I think it's really got to be a federal solution. And I don't get the sense, I mean, there is discussion in Washington about legislation to do it on the federal side, but I don't get the sense there's a lot of momentum behind it. So I think it's going to be frustrating for small businesses. I would recommend not counting on seeing any sort of legislation, at the very least, any sort of legislation that grandfathers that goes backwards in time to cover this pandemic, I think is going to be very hard to see passing. And so I would, one thing you might do if you're a business that is in this situation, there are a number of class action lawsuits percolating all over the country, with businesses suing their insurance companies about even if it's spelled out in black and white that viruses are excluded. I've only seen one decision so far, a judge's decision in any of these, and to be honest, from what I could tell, it was in New York. It seemed like it went more the way of the insurers and the businesses. But the class action suits, you really don't. I don't think you stand to lose anything by joining, because generally attorneys in class action suits are taking it on and expecting to get some sort of windfall out of a settlement. They're not expecting to be paid up front. So that's something you might want to look into if you're really concerned about that. But I wouldn't wait around for legislation.
Definitely makes sense. Okay, the next question is about consultants and coaches that are offering free services online. This person wants to know, when do you think companies and individuals will be ready to pay for services again? And what does that marketplace look like post-pandemic?
Well, it's a great question because, we're so much of what's being offered now is being offered for free or for a nominal price because it's perceived as it's less valuable because it's online versus in person. I think that's slowly going to change, but I still think that you're going to be hard pressed to charge the same amount that you charge. I mean, this webinar is a perfect example. If we had it at in a hotel conference, room, we might be charging maybe at the very least just to cover our costs. But I think it's going to be a long time before companies are willing to pay the same amount for online services versus in-person services. In fact, I would be surprised if it happens. I think you'll be able to start charging a little more. I know for a lot of coaches, conference organizers, business groups, this is normally a major source of revenue, and it's been difficult. But I think the way to do it is to look for some sort of cooperative sponsor, someone who is willing to pay to have their name in front of your audience rather than charging your audience to log in. I mean, obviously, for these sorts of things, you would find sponsors in the past when they were live sometimes. But I think it's even more important now in this environment. Of course, this is a tough environment for getting sponsorship dollars. So I'm not saying that's easy. But the post-COVID is looking. Even though people are racing to find a vaccine, I don't see us having big in-person events in the Boston area, and this year at any time this year, unfortunately.
Definitely, yeah. It's interesting because I think the remote programming, like what we're doing, is much more scalable. I think it's easier to reach people, but if you're looking to monetize, it's definitely a completely different business model. And I think there's been a large number of different even events or podcasts that have adapted pretty well through this, but there's pros and cons to having the gatherings in person versus online and vice versa. So, and same with the services, it's tough if you're a consultant or coach to not be able to meet hands-on really for the most part, unless it's, a one-on-one coffee outside somewhere, most likely. So,
I do think that the plus is that your audience can be, you can get a much bigger audience. If you're used to only doing face-to-face in-person coaching, for example, you're limited by how far you can drive in a given day, and now you can expand that. So there are ways to take advantage of it, but I think it's not. I don't think that. I don't think you're going to see. I don't think companies are going to be willing to pay for the same service when it's online versus in person.
Definitely. I would say lead generation is going to be a little easier because of the free model. And then when it comes to, if you're a coach or a consultant, then, monetization is definitely going to be different for sure. Okay. So the next question's around city and reducing taxes possibly in terms of, businesses obviously losing revenue. This person's talking about how the city, their revenue is also taking a hit. It's kind of the same thing between landlords and tenants in terms of, it's a two-sided marketplace and both are taking on different challenges. So talk a little bit about, if you know anything about, moves for the city to, support the businesses around taxes and things like that. Do you expect this to be a possibility, or what does the future look like in terms of that?
Well, I assume we're talking about the city of Boston. They have had some flexibility in terms of property tax payments, but I don't think. The city, the budget's so reliant on property taxes that I don't expect huge concessions. All cities in Massachusetts are sort of taking a hit in maybe not necessarily in property taxes, but in some of the other places, sort of, parking revenue or local options taxes on meals and lodging. So budgets are tight, and I think it's going to be hard to have too much in the way of concessions. Of course, small businesses, most of them are not paying property taxes directly. Maybe they're leasing space from a landlord that's paying property taxes, and maybe that's part of the lease. And so then it's a question of, it goes back to this tug of war that so many businesses are facing with their landlords in terms of some negotiations and some relief for the length of the pandemic. And I think that's where I think that the city is, they only have so many people, but I do think they're trying to be supportive of these negotiations, and they want to see landlords give some relief to their tenants. So there's a small office of small business assistants at City Hall, and I would recommend any small business that's struggling to reach out to them, and hopefully that they can provide some guidance, both in terms of maybe there's some relief on the property tax side, but I think for most small businesses, it's going to be more advice on how to deal with the landlord.
Definitely. Talk a little bit about the residential side of the real estate market, because we did have one question about that. I know 2 weeks ago in our last session, we talked about everything around eviction legislation and things like that. So any updates around, anything that might be put into law, the extension, anything like that?
Okay, so there's sort of two different animals, but they're related. One is the residential real estate market. I think what we're seeing in Boston right now, it's still somewhat anecdotal. It's hard to draw conclusions about trends. Is that it's still the market's still hot, particularly in the suburbs. I am talking to some people that are saying that units are staying on the market longer in the city when they used to disappear right away. And that's understandable. I think a lot of people are still leery of going into a building with elevators. And also the city itself is, sad to say, a less appealing place with events all but disappeared, and nightclubs and bars shut down. So the suburbs are getting a benefit from this. I mean, there was a story in the Wall Street Journal the other day about Connecticut. We'll see how long this lasts, but Connecticut real estate brokers are finally seeing some signs of life, because this Connecticut economy has really struggled since the last recession. Because of this emphasis on urban living, and there's not really sort of a hip urban area in Connecticut that young people want to move to. And so a lot of suburban real estate has sort of been less than appealing. And now people in Manhattan are like, I'm out of here. I'm just going to, if I can work from home. And I think a lot of companies, and that's a major long-term impact that we're going to see, a lot of companies are going to be flexible about work from home. And so this puts, places a premium in well-to-do suburbs with good school districts. Also, I think you're going to see a shift in vacation areas where maybe that becomes the main house. If people don't need to commute into work and they can work from home, maybe you see more, people move into Cape Cod, more people move into New Hampshire. I do think you're not going to get too remote, at least as long as the pandemic's in play, because I don't think people want to be too far from healthcare. Now, the question about the eviction moratorium, as where Massachusetts has an eviction moratorium in place through the middle of August. The governor can extend that, but there is bill moving in the legislature to extend that, and there's a lot of support for that. Right now, landlords are suing. They suffered a setback at the Supreme Judicial Court to stop this, saying it's an unjust taking of their property. They are going to file a lawsuit in federal court, and there's an upcoming hearing in Superior Court. So the litigation's not dead. It's just sort of been pushed back a little. Meanwhile, I think at the State House, there's a lot of support for extending this eviction moratorium, which is primarily aimed at residential renters, but there is relief in there for small businesses as well. I honestly can't remember the cutoff or how it's defined, but small businesses are protected from being evicted as defined in that legislation.
Gotcha. Well, we'll keep monitoring it, and I'm sure we'll keep everyone informed as we have updates. We do have a couple live questions coming in, so why don't we try to get to as many of those as we can. First question's around the commuter rail. Do you have any updates in terms of changes with the commuter rail?
I mean, they're still running on a full schedule, and it's not that packed yet. So I don't know when the T plans to return to a regular schedule again. I think that they are sort of waiting for more people to come downtown, and I think a lot of that hinges on what happens with the schools, because if schools don't reopen in the fall, or if they reopen partially, then employers are going to be forced to allow more work from home, and then the T is going to be less reluctant is going to be more reluctant about expanding its getting back to normal with the train schedule. So it's funny how that is, how the fate of the schools could affect the fate of the T. But I think, at least with commuter rail, I think that they're linked.
Definitely. There's a lot of link between the schools and the economy for sure, in more ways than one. Next question's around businesses that might be getting an uplift based on the positive conditions, or at least the positive trend. Outside of hospitality, do you have any examples in the area of businesses that are starting to do better because the conditions are getting better, or at least trending upwards?
Well, people are out shopping again, and I think many retailers were closed completely. So I think they're happy to be back open, and many of them are still offering curbside and/or delivery service for people that don't feel comfortable going into the stores. So I've got to believe that the stores are, like, for example, bookstores, clothing stores are starting to see some benefits again. Likewise, like salons that were closed are benefiting again. I do think it's still, many people are still reluctant to you leave the house except for absolute necessity. I think around here, there's still a belief, and I think it's actually been good for us, that we have to be really careful and vigilant about the spread of the virus. And so the recovery is going to be slow. I fully expect that Massachusetts is going to remain in recession for the rest of the year, and that's going to be challenging for a lot of businesses. But we're in complete shutdown, or not complete, but many businesses were in complete shutdown for much of the spring. So the ones that were another good example is the hotels are starting to reopen again. Casinos are starting to reopen again, all happening this month. And so that's, some hotels were open throughout the pandemic. The casinos were not. But I think those industries are going to see a lift, but it's going to be really kept in check. I think we've talked about this. This has been a recurring theme, that when everyone shut down in March, I think we all hoped, oh yeah, we're going to open the doors again in, I don't know, say May or June, and we'll be back to normal, if not right away, within a matter of weeks. And I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, I think we're at phase 3 of a 4-phase plan into reopening the economy. But phase 4, many people don't expect the governor to pull the trigger on phase 4, which is the reopening of nightclubs and big events, concerts, pro sports where you attend to watch, until next year. And so that really, it's a small sector of the economy, but because it affects so many people, I think that you really need that to get to that phase 4. That assumes we're still in the pandemic. There's still going to be social distancing and masks, but it's as the governor describes it, as a new normal until the virus is gone. That new normal is probably not going to take place until we have a widely available vaccine.
Definitely. More specifically, this next question is kind of related. This person's asking about the tech sector specifically. What's the impact on the tech sector? And then also part of the question is about the impact on innovation, which I think is a good question in terms of, mainly tech companies were, some of them were already remote before the pandemic, but I'm sure most are now, especially with a lot of the co-working spaces in Boston. So what do you think the impact is on tech and then also on innovation, coming out of the pandemic?
That's a great question. So I think generally the tech sector has weathered this pretty well. For the most part, some of the tech companies that are specifically exposed to industries such as retail or hospitality that were really hammered by the virus have suffered a bit. But in general, tech companies are equipped, because they're primarily software companies, to work from home or work remotely. And so many tech companies have actually been hiring during this recession and the pandemic, and that will continue. I do think that I've heard different theories about in terms of innovation. I've heard people say, oh, during times like this, people have more time on their hands, and so they are more creative when they're not racing around just trying to fill orders. But also, I do think, when your meetings are just virtual, you do, and by and large, most companies still are just having virtual meetings, although, there obviously where you can have up to 50% of your office capacity. I think most companies are only bringing back small numbers of people still to the offices. And some brainstorming meetings are happening in driveways or in backyards, but I think those are very limited in number. I do think that you're hurt a bit by not being able to brainstorm with colleagues in person. It's not the free-flowing movement of ideas doesn't quite happen the same way over a call like this versus if you're in a room with a bunch of people, and you've got a whiteboard and magic marker and you're scribbling and you're riffing off each other. It's kind of hard to do over a Zoom call.
Definitely. One of the many changes. We did have a question about the colleges and universities and the reopening. I saw maybe it was last week or 2 weeks ago when Harvard put out their plan. They're leaving the tuition price the same, even though the classes are online. So, I know different colleges have different plans, and it's going to have different impacts depending on what those plans are on the larger economy. Any updates, any reporting in terms of, other colleges in the area, the trickle down effect, of those decisions? This is obviously a little bit separate than kind of, high schools and middle schools and elementary schools, but.
Yeah, I think that for colleges, it's generally speaking, they're keeping their tuition in place, and tuition is not cheap, even if maybe they're not charging for room and board, because they're bringing back, certain classes. Maybe it's the freshman in the senior class, or maybe, freshmen and juniors come fall, seniors and sophomores go spring. Another thing you're seeing is you're sort of, once you get to the Thanksgiving break, you're seeing schools say, we don't want you to come, we want you to stay away and do remote until the new semester. So you're not traveling back and forth and introducing another chance of bringing the virus back. The one positive this may bring, or one sector of the economy that may benefit from this, are hotels, because this schools that are bringing people back, the dorms really they have to be a lower capacity than they are, or than they have been in the past. They have to be less dense. And so the overflow, a lot of schools are talking to hotels about, not buying a box of room, but essentially leasing rooms long term to help kind of handle the overflow. So hotels, that's like a one silver lining in all of this, because the hotels really need the business right now. But of course, so many businesses are struggling with that depend, if you look at Harvard Square and how much of the businesses really depend on Harvard being in full force, both the undergraduate and the graduate programs. And so much of that is going to be virtual, that it's not going to be a crowded square come September. and that's going to hurt a lot of the businesses in that area.
Definitely. We'll do one more question, John. We had a question about the economy and income and wealth gap. What do you think needs to be done to help rebuild the economy to be more equitable in the area?
Wow, that's a tough question. It's unfortunately when in times like this, the wealth gap just gets bigger. The businesses, the sectors that are hardest hit tend to be lower income workers, while the higher income workers, can work remotely. They have room to work remotely. Same thing with the virus has spread more significantly in more lower income households, because they tend to be more densely populated. Buildings closer together, apartment buildings versus big mansions out in one of the W towns. And so it's a real, as we bring this back, and it's, dovetails with sort of some of the issues around Black Lives Matters. As we try to bring the economy back, policymakers are really going to have to make sure that the winnings for what the new economy doesn't just go to the people who are calling the shots before, but you also have to, it's a delicate dance, because you don't want to suppress business either. So I think one of the keys that business groups really need to step up, and they need to figure out a way to bring in minority contractors more, and connect them with businesses, much more so than just token gestures. I think a lot of minority-owned businesses often feel shut out of the system, and I think that's one way to sort of give, you kind of break down the stratification a bit. And I don't know if you can really legislate that, but I think it's incumbent about anyone in the business community to think about that, and how can what part can we play in bridging the gap for some of these underserved communities, or small businesses that are rising from these underserved communities. I know it's sort of a roundabout answer, but it sort of speaks to the challenges.
Right.
It's almost inevitable that this is just going to exacerbate the inequality that was already in place. And so it's something we all have to think about going forward.
Definitely. I mean, it's an enormous problem that affects, so many people in so many different ways. So it's definitely not a simple answer for sure. I just have one announcement to share with the group, and then John I'll turn it over to you for some closing thoughts. So the Boston Globe has teamed up with Vertex to host a series of 3 job fairs. So if you're a company looking to hire, or if you become unemployed as a result of COVID, the website is globe.com/jobs to learn more. The first job fair is on August 5th. And this information is also going to be and go get sent out in the thank you email with the link and more information. But just wanted to bring that to everyone's attention. John, this was great. Do you have anything else you want to add that we didn't get to cover in terms of the questions?
No, I just wanted to say one question I couldn't get to 2 weeks ago was someone had written a question about how they could help businesses in their area that are struggling. And I guess I would just say, this is something I've always believed in, but it's even more so important now to support your brick and mortar businesses. I think the habits of buying online really shifted much more so because of the pandemic, for obvious reasons. But if you care about brick and mortar, you got to kind of get back into that mode of going out. Just in my little neighborhood, we had a framing shop and a dry cleaning store that closed, and the owner said it was almost 100% because of the pandemic. And so we probably only have about 15 brick and mortar retailers in my little neighborhood, and now 2 are gone. I think that's probably typical. So think about, obviously framing shops and dry cleaning stores should be relatively immune from online sales, but I think people have habits have changed even more so to buying online. So try to help small businesses in your neighborhood if you can.
For sure. Well, John, always enjoyed it. We'll be back in 2 weeks to do another session. Continue to bring us the updates and the news. And we really appreciate everyone. This is 4 months we've been doing this now. We started out weekly, now we're on bi-weekly. So, appreciate everyone always tuning in and hanging out with us. And I know John and I enjoy it. So, John, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. It was great to talk. See you guys again in 2 weeks.
Appreciate it. See everybody soon.